This is the Beanie Bunnie Moo Moo. It's a Eurorack format dual oscillator made by the Chinese designer and musician Jeanie. It consists of two identical analogue VCOs with thru-zero FM, plus a noise source and a bunch of other smart features that open up a huge sound palette. It really is a fantastic analogue patching playground. Here's what I've been doing with it. If you're not familiar with Jeanie, I highly recommend checking out her YouTube channel, which showcases her own music and has more videos exploring various patches with the Moo Moo. She's made a lot of music with bookless systems, and the Moo Moo definitely gets into that kind of West Coast territory, but it's equally at home in classic subtractive patches. Jeanie very kindly sent me this unit a few weeks back, and I have to say it's one of the most well thought out designs I've come across for a dual oscillator. It really lends itself to creative self-patching, and it's reminded me why I love working with analogue oscillators. So in this video I'm going to build a few patches to show you what it's capable of, and maybe spark a few ideas for things to try with whatever gear you happen to be using. But first, let's take a closer look at Moo Moo's panel and controls. Moo Moo is 24 HP wide, and the design is almost perfectly symmetrical with an oscillator on each side. Starting from the top, each VCO has a thru-zero offset control which acts as a coarse tuning control, and then there's a large fine tuning control with a range of about an octave. There's also an octave selector which lets you jump in full octave increments. There's a CV input for this too, which is something I haven't really come across before and is a really great addition. The whole tuning setup is really well thought out and optimised for audio rate modulation patches, as you'll see. You might notice that there's no input labelled volt per octave. The exponential FM input down here has a volt per octave response, so that's where to patch your regular pitch CV. The other FM input is for linear thru-zero FM, and there's also an attenuator for that. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of thru-zero FM in this video, but there's plenty of content out there if you want to learn more. All you really need to know is that it sounds fantastic, and it's generally considered to be a more controllable and musical flavour of FM than the more common exponential FM. Each oscillator has separate outputs for sine, triangle, sawtooth and square, plus a pulse wave with variable pulse width. There's a mini pot and CV input for pulse width modulation, and this cuts out altogether at the extremes, which you could exploit for some cool effects. Each oscillator also has a sync input, and these can be switched between hard and soft sync behaviour with a long push of the button near the top. Moo Moo has a built-in noise source too, which runs through its own dedicated state variable filter. There are cutoff and resonance controls for that up here, and the same button switches between low pass, band pass and high pass modes with a short press. There's a noise level control on each oscillator which routes the filtered noise directly into the thru-zero FM bus in parallel with the attenuated thru-zero FM input. This is great for percussive sounds or random pitch modulation. There's a CV input for the noise filter cutoff over here, and you can tap the filtered noise output over here to mix with the waveform outputs or use elsewhere in your patch. Speaking of mixing, this is where we get to the thing I think really sets Moo Moo apart. Each side has a dedicated 2-input crossfading mixer with CV control. You can use these to combine two of the wave outputs and mix between them, and you can crossfade at audio rates for more complex wave-splicing effects, as you'll see. You can also leave one side unpatched and just use them as general-purpose VCAs. These mixers really expand the self-patching possibilities of the module. Finally, just a quick word on the internal normalizations. The outputs of the mixers are each internally normal to the thru-zero FM input of the opposite channel, and the exponential FM input on VCO1, the volt per octave input, is normal to the one on VCO2, so both oscillators will track the pitch of a single input by default. So that's the controls. Let's start patching. So let's get started with a look at the thru-zero FM capabilities of the Moo Moo, which is probably one of its main selling points and one of the more powerful ways you've got to sculpt the sound inside the oscillator. The way I've got this patch set up is I have a 7-step sequence from analog step 8 just off screen, being quantized and coming into the exponential FM input. That will normal across to the input on the right-hand oscillator internally, so they'll both be tracking the same pitch sequence. I'm taking the sine wave output through the internal mixer, through the green trace on data, and then through the Rabbit Elephant natural gate, low-pass gate up here. And then that's just going straight into the mixer. If I get the sequence going, we'll just listen to the sine wave through the LPG. So nice simple sequence, nice short plucky kind of tone. And I've got the second oscillator, or the right hand oscillator. Again, I've got the sine wave going through the internal mixer. I've got the square on the other side, but I'm just mixing fully to the sine wave at the moment. That's what you can see on the blue trace, but you can't hear this yet. I've got this turned down in the mixer. I'm just going to use this to frequency modulate the left-hand oscillator, because the output of this mixer is internally normal to the thru-zero FM input. So if I start turning that up, right-hand oscillator is tuned up an octave and a fifth. And at low indexes of FM, pitch remains pretty stable. Starts to deviate a bit as we get higher and the tones get a bit more extremely modulated. But we've got that lovely kind of West Coast style FM through an LPG tone, which I'm a real sucker for. And we can play with the frequency relationship. Let's tune the right oscillator up another octave. Play with the fine tuning. We can kind of dial in all manner of nice sympathetic frequency ratios. And the amount of FM has quite a big impact on the nature of the sound as well. So this is all very cool, but as you probably noticed, the pitch is kind of going all over the place as we play with both frequencies and the index of FM. So let's try running oscillator, or the right hand oscillator, a bit slower and syncing the left oscillator to that. So we're going to use the pulse output into the sync input, and it's hard sync at the moment because the little LED's on. And now the right hand oscillator is our master pitch. And however we tune this, when we start FMing the right oscillator, the pitch is completely stable, but we still get this kind of range of lovely FM tones underneath there. So let's tune. That sounds pretty cool. Now what we can do is also run the output of the right hand oscillator through the other side of the natural gate, or the other channel, just to reinforce the kind of fundamental frequency. So I've got the kind of sine here. Let's just turn down the left oscillator again. So we've got that kind of sine from oscillator B, or the right oscillator. Let's mix across into the square wave. So we've got a lovely kind of square wave through natural gate here, which is a nice rubbery kind of bass tone. And now if we bring up the left oscillator again, which is being FM'd, it's now being FM'd by that square wave. Gives another character to the FM again. So just with a kind of sine and a square, we've got this really beautifully rich and controllable kind of tone. Let's bring some drums in too. Levels and dial in. Okay, for this patch I want to explore using the voltage-controlled crossfaders in Moo Moo to do a bit of wave shaping. So without using an external filter I can get some kind of harmonic variation out of the oscillator by crossfading between two of the different wave shapes. I'm going to use it as two independent VCOs with two different sequences coming in. So let's start with the left-hand side. If I get the sequence going, at the moment I've got the triangle and the square into the two inputs of the crossfader, and that's running through the green trace here, and I'm panned over to the triangle, input A, and if I just manually pan over to input B, that's the square. So I pan back to the triangle. It sounds a bit like a low-pass filter because that's kind of what a low-pass filter does. It kind of rounds off the edges of a angular wave like a square and makes it a bit simpler. So what I can do is use the mix CV input to feed a little bit of slow LFO into that. I've got attenuated LFO from Oct coming in to Quadrat here, just by, if I turn the crossfader to somewhere in the middle, that kind of defines the central point of this modulation, and the LFO will move the mix above and below that point. Let's just add a bit of reverb in the mixer. So we've got this kind of morphing sound, again no filter involved, just mixing between wave shapes. And let's try the other side. So I've got a slightly higher pitch sequence here, I've got the octave tuned up, and I'm doing the same thing with the crossfader. I've got the sine wave and the saw wave in this case though, going into the crossfader, and if I crossfade over to input B, that's the saw, back to the sine again. This is the blue trace on the scope. And with the modulation for this one I'm going to do something slightly different. I've got a copy of the envelope that's open in the VCA for this VCO. That's also running through a channel of Quadrat, and if I turn this up, we're sort of enveloping that crossfade mix. So as the envelope opens, that wave becomes something closer to a saw and it fades down to a triangle. So we get that kind of a sound that's pretty similar to a low-pass filter opening. It's obviously not resonant, but it still sounds quite nice. There's something quite pure about this waveform mixing rather than filtering. And let's bring in the bass part again. There's a little bit of delay to the top part. One obvious use for a dual VCO is in stereo patching, and for this patch I've set up a really basic subtractive voice. I'm taking the two pulse outputs from the Moo Moo, I've detuned the right side slightly relative to the left, I'm taking them through the scope, through the Zagreb filter from Chaos Devices and into the Megatang mixer, which is also acting as the VCA, and I'm just using the keystep 37 over here to produce pitch and gate information to kind of play this like a conventional synth. Pip slope is the only envelope I'm using at the moment. So that sounds like this. So you can hear this nice rich detuned square wave, and I can filter that down in classic subtractive fashion. Let's get some pulse width modulation happening to kind of modulate the width of these pulse waves. I'm going to use filter 8 from Analogue, just in this uppercase. That's in LFO mode, so it's producing two sine waves at the same frequency but opposite phases, and those LFOs are being attenuated by Quadrat here and then into the PWM input on Moo Moo. So let's get a little sequence going and then I'll bring up that modulation. So you can see the phases are being modulated at the same frequency but in opposite directions, which in stereo gives us this really rich sound. Got a bit of envelope on the filter as well, it's had a bit of resonance. But we can take things up a notch by modulating that pulse width at audio rate. So I can flick filter 8 into audio mode. and increase the amount of modulation. Now we're getting this much more timbrally rich sound. If I play with the coarse tuning, dial into more or less sympathetic frequency relationships. And I've actually set up an octave switcher here. So as a stereo subtractive voice, once we start bringing audio rate pulse width modulation in, lovely range of tones here. One of the really clever things about Moo Moo's design is that these built-in mixers outputs are actually inverted, and that means with a bit of self-patching we can create 4-quadrant multiplication or ring modulation type effects. Let me show you how. At the moment I've got the sine wave from the first oscillator going into the first input of the first mixer, and that's what we're looking at on the scope, and that sounds like this, just a standard sine wave. Pretty straightforward. But if we take a copy of that using a stackable and go into the other mixer on the other side, take the output of that into the second input of the first mixer, that's going to give us an inverted copy of the sine wave, which means that if I pan across to the centre, they'll cancel each other out and we'll get silence. That's the right-hand mixer, that's the left-hand mixer, and they're inverted copies of each other, so they're 108 degrees out of phase, which means with the crossfader in the centre, can't quite tune in exact silence, but near enough. So now if we take the second VCO's sine wave output, which we're not using at all yet, and go into the mix CV of this first crossfader, we get ring modulation type tones. That kind of classic. Now these sounds are really great for techno, and I'm going to try running them through a low pass gate again. Let's get a kick drum, and I've got a little melodic sequence from Water. I'm not quantizing this. I'm using natural gate again as the LPG. And just by tuning in like this, we can find these kind of quite more atonal or more harmonic, depending on where we kind of tune these. I've got R&D step in the other case here, which is generating some random voltages on each note. So let's get some random unipolar voltages to the octave switch, or the octave CV rather, on the second oscillator. So we'll get these occasional octave jumps that give us this nice little bit of timbral variation. And I'm going to take a phase shifted copy of that sequence from Water, which is just some pitch CV voltages. I'm going to run that through an attenuator and into the mix CV on this second mixer, but I'm going to connect the noise output from the internal noise generator to the other side of that crossfading mixer. Just get in there. Now if I turn this attenuator up, we'll introduce bits of noise that right-hand oscillators which is going into the mix CV of the first one, and this gives us a nice extra kind of percussive layer and noisy percussion that's related to the pitch sequence but out of phase with it. freaky, we could introduce a bit of thru-zero FM. Just being fed from the output of this second mixer. Next, I want to build a really harmonically rich drone sound using the crossfader on one side of Moo Moo at audio rates to splice between two waveforms. I'm going to use the sine and the square, two very, very simple waveforms, into the two inputs of the crossfader. And if I just open it up, that's the sine. It's running through the scope here. It's also running through the Zagreb filter from Chaos Devices, which is wide open at the moment. I'll be introducing that a bit later. That's mixed over to the square. And back to the sine. And if we were to do that mixing very, very fast, like at audio rates, like at the same rate as the wave itself. So let's take the pulse wave out of the same oscillator into the mix CV. And what happens here is this effectively switches the wave between the sine and the square mid-cycle. And depending on how wide that pulse is, which I can adjust with the pulse width, that determines at what point in the cycle the waves switch. So at one extreme, when the pulse is actually silent, we're just getting the sine wave. And as we adjust that pulse width, the switching happens at a different point in the cycle until we just get the square at the other extreme. So by playing with the pulse width, we can do some wave shaping here and get some interesting new wave shapes. We could obviously patch different waveform outputs into those two sides, we could patch noise in, we could get some interesting tones that way. But where things get really harmonically interesting is if we switch that wave with a different oscillator that's not running at the same frequency as the two waves going in. Let's go from oscillator B's pulse wave, and we instantly get this much more unpredictable tone, but we can dial in to a sympathetic frequency ratio. I'm an octave up here, and as we sweep through, we find these kind of sweet spots where this beating effect happens, and then so that sine and square are already sounding pretty metallic and complex. We can bring this under control a bit by syncing oscillator B to oscillator A. So let's take the pulse out from the A side and go into the hard sync input. And now this is kind of locked in tune with that side, which means we get this kind of combination kind of sync and wave splicing effect as we sweep through the octaves and the frequencies. And we get these really interesting combinations. And again, we can play with the pulse width of this switching oscillator too, which has quite a big effect on the tone. And let's go down an octave here. And let's start modulating this stuff and filtering it a bit. So I'm going to take a slow LFO, I've got a few LFOs from Oct off screen. Let's go into the pulse width, just attenuate it a bit through Quadrat here. And let's take another one into, let's go into the thru-zero linear FM input. Basically doing some pitch sweeping. Let's filter this down a bit. Let's add another slow LFO to the spread control and the filter, which will kind of stereoize things, and take yet another one into the cutoff and add a bit of resonance and add a big bath of reverb. that sine and square that we started with are now transformed into something much more interesting, much more harmonically rich, and with the slow modulation of these various parameters. Playing with these octave relationships. Got a really interesting sound world to explore. Okay, to finish, I just want to have a little look at using Moo Moo as a drum and percussion synth. The built-in noise source, and especially the built-in filter, mean it's really powerful for creating kind of percussive sounds. I'm going to use it as two independent voices. I'm going to use the left side to make a kick drum, and I'm going to use the right side to make three different percussion sounds with the aid of the Jasmine and Olive Tree's Traffic, which lets me feed in three triggers and then produce three different sets of CV values to modulate different parameters, which means every trigger can create a different drum sound effectively. Let's start with the kick. I've got some triggers coming in from the BeatStep Pro, which I'm just going to start playing. And it's dead simple so far. I've just got the sine wave going through the mixer. I've got the sine and triangle both going in, but I'm panned across to fully sine wave. That is being attenuated slightly and then going into the Lublin pingable VCA from Chaos Devices, which is giving us the kind of amplitude envelope. And then I'm multing this trigger to pip slope just for a short, very snappy kind of envelope, which I'm going to feed into the exponential FM input to give a bit of pitch modulation at the start. Because at the moment you can hear it doesn't really have much of an attack transient. I'm also firing a copy of the trigger, by the way, into the hard sync input just to give us a consistent kind of waveform start for every hit, which is quite important when you're working with low frequency sine waves. Let's just bring up that FM. And play with the envelope decay time on pip slope. And we can get to that real kind of 909 territory. If you want to get a bit more extreme than this, you could go into the exponential FM input, but for this patch I think it sounds fine just with the linear thru-zero maxed and this kind of envelope. So there's a kick drum. As for the other sounds, I've got three other triggers from the BeatStep Pro going into Traffic, as I mentioned, and I'm using the right hand side. I've got a mixture of the noise output and the triangle wave. And one of the things I'm controlling on Traffic is the mix between them. I'm sort of routing CV output C to the mix CV. So each of my three sounds can have a different blend of triangle and noise. So the snare, first of all, that's a kind of mix of the triangle and the noise, which I've filtered through the bandpass filter, the one that's built into Moo Moo. So I can play with this balance here to have more or less of that noise, and I can play with the filter frequency of the noise. So let's keep it kind of mid-rangey. And the other parameter I'm controlling with Traffic is effectively the decay time. It's a bit of CV going into the Lublin VCA, which the other channel is running through. So that can give us kind of longer and shorter, snappier kind of tones. Next pad is a sort of closed hi-hat. So I've got much less of the triangle, I've got a shorter envelope and a higher pitched filter, and then I've got an open hi-hat which is similar but with a longer decay. So these are all coming out of the right side of Moo Moo, but they're with different modulation settings for various parameters thanks to Traffic. Let's get a little pattern going. So with a bit of creative patching you can really just turn Moo Moo into a mini drum machine with a pretty powerful kick and these quite interesting noisy percussion kind of sounds. I can just play with these to fine tune. And with Traffic I can randomize things too for a bit of fun. So I'm going to leave things there for today. As you can hopefully tell, there's a hell of a lot you can do with this thing, and I'm only ever going to scratch the surface in a video like this. Thanks again to Jeanie for hooking me up with it, and thanks to you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a comment, and do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.